Good afternoon, and welcome to the New York State Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics webinar entitled, Can a Mediterranean Diet with Lean Meats Reduce Cardiovascular Risk? I am Carol Donation, President of the New York State Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. This webinar has been applied for one CPEU. All registered live attendees will receive the CPEU at the email address used for the webinar registration as soon as it is available from CDR. Please to be sure to keep a copy for your files. A few housekeeping notes. Those calling in on a phone, please mute your phone to minimize background noise. If your computer screen goes into screensaver mode during the webinar, please move your computer mouse to reactivate your screen. The webinar will begin momentarily. Let me walk you through a few key functions we will be using in the webinar. There will be a question and answer following the webinar. If you have a question, please type in your question via the question box at the middle of your control panel during the question and answer session. To ensure audio quality, all attendees' microphones are muted during the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and the link will be available to the attendees. The webinar is sponsored by the New York State Beef Council, a NISAN Strategic Alliance partner. Our speaker, Dr. Wayne Campbell, is a professor of nutrition science at Purdue University. Dr. Campbell was a member of the 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans Advisory Committee and a member of the 2018 Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee. Dr. Campbell's research includes studying the effects of food form, portion size, and dietary patterning, including Mediterranean-style eating pattern, on cardiometabolic risk factors, appetite, and weight control. It is now my pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dr. Wayne Campbell.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate all the organizers for helping to have this webinar be available to all of you. Before I begin, I would just like to start with a disclosure that I do have that you may be, just for clarity, that I do receive research support from a number of agricultural commodity organizations, including the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, National Pork Board, and the North Dakota Beef Commission. And as was mentioned, I have been members of both the Dietary and the Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans. So when we talk about Mediterranean diet, we think about the Mediterranean Sea over in that divides Europe from Africa and parts of Asia. And there is no specific Mediterranean diet. There are a variety of Mediterranean-style eating patterns that are based on foods that come from and cultures from these various countries that surround the Mediterranean Sea. But there is, and this actually, you may think of this as a weakness to not have a specific diet, but it actually allows for diversity in how people can adjust the components of a Mediterranean-style eating pattern to their own tastes. When we think back, probably back into the 1950s and 1960s, the Mediterranean eating pattern became known to the United States through the research of Ansel Keys in his 7 countries study, where he was studying the effects of, or just documenting the influence of traditional eating patterns in the Mediterranean region, including southern Greece with olive farmers. And this, what he described as a Mediterranean eating pattern soon became a gold standard for cardiovascular health. And there is a rich history of research supporting that consuming a Mediterranean-style eating pattern does have heart health promoting effects, including significant reductions in coronary heart disease and reducing the risks of stroke in adults. On the right-hand side of this slide, you will notice a pyramid that was made probably about 20 years ago that sort of describes the Mediterranean diet pattern. And I wanted to just briefly emphasize that red meat was considered to be while it is something that is consumed in Mediterranean regions frequently, that for the purposes of the Americanized version of a Mediterranean diet, red meat was encouraged to be consumed infrequently, if at all. And we will come back to that as we move through the presentation. So within the context of the dietary guidelines for Americans, the questions become, what about red meat as it relates to cardiovascular disease? And one of the things that, as a committee member from the dietary guidelines, that was somewhat frustrating to me, but is an important consideration in how we view the science about red meat, is that especially back in the 1980s and the 1990s and early 2000s, red meat and processed meat were lumped together as one category of meat. And you can hopefully appreciate that processed meat does not have to be red, and red meat does not have to be processed. And yet, from the guidelines perspective, we were not at liberty to be able to reinterpret the research that had been published or use different vocabularies to redefine what red and processed meat was. Now, the upshot of this is that the conclusions in the dietary guidelines is that strong evidence from mostly prospective cohort studies, but also randomized controlled trials, has shown that eating patterns that include lower intakes of meats, as well as processed meats and processed poultry, are associated with reduced risks for cardiovascular disease in adults, and that there's moderate evidence for similar associations with other morbidities, including diabetes and some types of cancer. Two things that I'd like to highlight in this statement is that most of the research were from prospective cohort studies, which are wonderful at looking at associations, but are not well suited to look at cause and effect. The second thing that I would like to mention is that when they say lower intake of meats, it's helpful to know how much is lower, and we'll get to that in the next few slides. So what is meat? For today's presentation, I'm going to use the dietary guidelines definitions. That meat is also known as red meat and is beef, pork, lamb, veal, goat, and non-bird game. Basically, if it has a hoof, it's likely to be included in that category. And that processed meats, while all meat is processed in some way, the processing usually revolves around some sort of a obtaining the meat that is designed for preservation, whether or not it might be smoking or curing or salting or adding chemical preservatives such as nitrates. Now, so when we look at cohort studies to associate cardiovascular disease with higher red meat intake, and these were some of the data that were used for the dietary guidelines, you will see that they were looking at a health professionals follow-up study as well as a nurse's health study. And both of these show that as you increase the number of servings of total red meat intake per day, there is a progressive increase in your hazard ratio, which is a reflection of the risk for you to have some sort of a cardiovascular disease event. And indeed, they show that men and women have about a 9 to 12% increased risk of having a cardiovascular disease death when you consume more than a half a serving per day. Now, a half a serving per day is not something that people typically consume, but just keep in mind that you could convert that servings per day to servings per week, and it would come out somewhere around a serving or 2 servings per day, excuse me, 2 servings per week of about 3-ounce portions. And so you'll see with the hazard ratio, 1 is neutral, and anything higher than 1 represents a higher risk. And this became the cutoff of recommendations for how much red meat to consume on a daily basis or prorated over a weekly basis, about 2 servings per week. Now, this is also has been adopted by many different organizations that are making recommendations on red meat intake. And you'll notice the 2010 DASH dietary patterns, the 2010 USDA food patterns from the 2010 dietary guidelines, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report that I served on is about the same, and the World Cancer Research Fund. So you can see they're all about 10 to 12, 13 ounces per week of red meat as a recommended intake. What is curious, though, is that the 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans actually does not have a specific recommendation for red meat intake. What they've done is combined meats with poultry and eggs into the protein foods category, and they give a total intake recommendation of about 26 ounce equivalents per week. And 1 ounce equivalent for red meats is 1 ounce of meat. But there's no more specificity regarding whether or not how much red meat or poultry or eggs to consume to obtain this weekly amount of protein-rich foods. Now, I mentioned that most of the data were from cohort studies. Another type of research is our randomized controlled trials, where usually with controlled feeding studies. This type of research is more geared toward being able to actually look at cause and effect relationships. However, one of the limitations of this type of research is that because it takes so long for people to develop morbidities and ultimately have to die, that randomized controlled trials are not suited for looking at outcomes, health-related outcomes. They're more commonly used and more effectively used to look at risk factors for disease as opposed to the disease itself. My research group and I, we looked at the literature and published last year a study, a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, where we took this 0.5 servings per day threshold, and we wanted to see, well, is there a difference in the health profiles of people when they consume at or above or below this threshold? And based on the cohort data or the epidemiological data that I showed you in the last slide, we hypothesized that higher total amounts of red meat consumption would negatively affect blood lipids and blood pressures. And so when we look at all of the literature, what we found is that the control groups, which were consuming less than 0.5 grams per serving, the vast majority of those studies were specifically looking at meat-free diets, red meat-free diets. So the median amount of meat consumed in that the control groups was none. In contrast, the intervention groups, on average, were having about a little over 2 servings per day, and you can see that it went from about 2.4 ounces per day all the way up to almost 18 ounces per day. This is very, very high amount of meat. Actually, it was a study from Australia that was specifically feeding people kangaroo meat. So what did we find? There were a host of studies that compared the red with and without or low and high amounts of red meat. And what we observed was that consuming red meat had no effect on changes in blood lipids and lipoproteins. And this is a graph that shows all of the different studies. And you'll notice down at the bottom, for example, with total cholesterol, if you're, oops, excuse me, let me back up from that. I clicked too quickly. If what we're interested in is this little red diamond down here. And what we want to know is that diamond, which shows the summary of all of these various studies, has that diamond shifted away from 0? And if it has, then that would be an indication that either consuming the higher red meat was either health promoting or health compromising relative to consuming the controlled diet. And when we look up at these weighted mean differences, the number that I care about from a statistical standpoint is this confidence interval. And you'll notice that while total cholesterol was going down a little bit, there's both a negative value and a positive value. And any time that there is both a negative and a positive value for the 95th percent confidence intervals, then this means that red meat did not have any influence on changes in total cholesterol compared to eating the control diets. And the same happened for the LDL cholesterol, and the same happened for the HDL cholesterol. So when we look at blood pressures, again, we see exactly the same thing. There were fewer studies that had looked at blood pressure, but again, the negative and the positive values here indicate that consuming red meat had no effect on changes in blood pressure, either for systolic or for diastolic blood pressures. So we concluded and interpreted from this study that consuming greater than a half a serving of red meat per day, mainly as unprocessed beef and pork, does not affect lipids, lipoproteins, or blood pressures compared to essentially diets that were void of red meat. And that these results were from a variety of individuals consuming a variety of eating patterns. So let's go on and look at whether or discuss whether or not red meat can be part of a healthy eating pattern. Based on the epidemiologic data, you may suggest that red meats, if they are bad for your heart, that they might actually blunt or negate the benefits of adopting and maintaining a healthy eating pattern. And when you look at the 2015-20 dietary guidelines, they talk about red meats in this following statement. Food pattern modeling has demonstrated that lean meats and lean poultry can contribute important nutrients within the limits of sodium, calories, and saturated fats and added sugars. These are the 4 types of nutrients that are deemed to be nutrients of concern for overconsumption, and that total calories, when consumed in recommended amounts in healthy eating patterns, such as the U.S. healthy style diet or the Mediterranean style eating pattern. Now, when we look at the Mediterranean patterns, you can show that there may be various health benefits with red meat intake. I mentioned at the beginning of our webinar that a Mediterranean-style diet has traditionally been shown to have reduced the risks of coronary heart disease and reduced your risk of stroke. And that there are both observational studies, most of the research is from these cohort observational studies, and the randomized controlled trials. The one that's the most well known is the Predimed study, and but there have been others since then. Now this graph, or this figure, shows the ounces of total red meat intake that people consumed for these various studies based on a 2,000 calorie per day diet. And when we look at we put these amounts of red meat in context with what people typically consume, the U.S. average intake of red meat is about 18 ounces per week. And yet you see that most of these studies were that showed the health promoting effects of a Mediterranean style eating pattern had higher red meat intakes than people in the U.S. typically consume. And when you look at it in relation to some other recommended eating patterns, including the DASH OmniHeart eating pattern that is recommending even lower amounts of red meat, as low as 6 ounces per week, you can see that all of the research that's been done showing that the Mediterranean pattern is health promoting and heart healthy have used red meat intakes above this amount of meat. I would like you just to keep in mind this 18 ounces per week level as the U.S. average intake. We'll come back to that in a little bit later in the presentation. So my research group was very interested in assessing whether or not red meat actually may be or not be antagonistic to the health promoting effects of adopting a Mediterranean eating pattern. And so we have specifically evaluated the typical amounts of red meat that people consume, which was about 18 ounces per week, or the recommended amount, which was about 6 ounces per week. And we hypothesized the consumption of a Mediterranean diet would improve cardiovascular disease risk factors, and that the inclusion of higher amounts of red meat would not influence these improvements. We did a randomized crossover design experiment. And you see the design here. People that participated agreed to be given and consume all of the food that they ate for about 5 weeks. And they started the first time by either eating the control or the Mediterranean diet, or the red meat diet. They then went and they ate their usual diets for a 5-week washout period, and then came back and crossed over and ate the other diet with a different amount of red meat. What we observed was that adopting a Mediterranean diet improved people's blood pressures. You can see that the systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressures were going down. And also that you notice that there was no statistical difference between whether or not they consumed the lower or the higher amount of red meat. There was no time by diet effect. These asterisks here represent just a reduction overall due to consuming the Mediterranean diet, not a difference based on whether or not they were eating which amount of red meat they were consuming. When we look at their lipids, we see this same thing. Adopting a Mediterranean diet certainly was heart healthy from the standpoint of reducing people's cholesterols. There was a difference in reductions in their triglycerides. There was reductions in LDLs, HDLs, and ApoB. And you'll notice, actually, and this is provocative, but it needs to be confirmed with more research, that actually it suggested, if you notice here with this arrow and this not really changing, that there might be something going on with respect to that actually higher amounts of red meat might actually be better for their lipid changes. But we're saying that very cautiously until we can do some follow-up research. So collectively, this research shows that lean, unprocessed red meat can be part of a healthy eating pattern. It's not only our study, but also several other studies that have shown this, that consuming 4 to 6 ounces of lean, unprocessed red meat does not hinder the effectiveness of either a DASH diet pattern or a Mediterranean pattern to improve cardiovascular disease risk factors. Now, I'd like to switch gears just for a minute. And if you recall, with that experiment, with our randomized controlled trial, the participants came in and we gave them all of their food for about 5 weeks. Then we let them go back and eat whatever they wanted to as a washout for 5 weeks. And then we had them consume another 5 weeks with a controlled the experimental diet. And the subjects could have consumed either the lower or the higher amount of red meat at any given to start the first intervention, but half of them were doing one and half of them were doing the other diets. What we've done is then we were asking ourselves a bit of a different question. Independent of which diet, how much red meat they consumed, if you look at the results chronologically, was there any what was the pattern of changes in their cardiovascular disease risk factors? And we were specifically interested because we know that adherence to healthy eating patterns is often short-lived and can lead to repetitive attempts of adopting but not maintaining healthy eating patterns. And I'm sure that many of you that work with clients they have great motivation, they do it, they stick to their healthier diet for a while, and then they sort of revert back to their usual less healthy diets, and then they'll pick up encouragement in some way, and then they'll readopt it and go back and forth. So we were thinking of this patterning of adopting, abandoning, and readopting healthy eating patterns as healthy eating pattern cycling. And it's somewhat akin to the weight cycling that we're all familiar with, where people are losing weight, then gaining it back, and then losing it again, gaining it back. What we're doing is using the same concept, but instead of body weight, we're looking at what pattern of food they're eating. And we hypothesized that healthy eating pattern cycling would improve, then worsen, and again improve cardiovascular disease risk factors. And so, as I described earlier, we have a dietary intervention for 5 or 6 weeks. Then we have a washout period, and then we have a second dietary pattern, controlled feeding pattern. We looked at the cardiovascular outcomes chronologically using data from 2 randomized crossover designs, and this research was published just in the last couple of weeks. And what we observed was that we have a cardiometabolic, what we describe as a cardiometabolic roller coaster. It's a healthy eating pattern cycling. You take your systolic blood pressure, you take someone's plasma or serum insulin, take someone's total cholesterol, and within 5 or 6 weeks, all of these outcomes improve, which is very encouraging. The point of emphasis, which hopefully might be a motivation for your clients to stick with a healthy eating pattern, is that they lose the benefits that they've worked hard to achieve very quickly within about 5 weeks. But the good news is if they readopt the healthy eating pattern, then the improvements occur again. This is really encouraging because this suggests that our body, at least in the short term, does not become resistant to metabolically adopting or benefiting from changing from an unhealthy to a healthy eating pattern. And we saw this same pattern in a host of different outcomes related to blood pressures, glucose, and lipids. So the take home from this, which is something that you might think is intuitively would occur, but we had not found any documentation of this published in research literature, that adopting a healthy eating pattern improves cardiovascular disease risk factors, but that these improvements are short-lived when a healthy eating pattern is abandoned, but that readopting the healthy eating pattern improves the cardiovascular risk factors again, comparably to when they did it the first time. And so we would certainly encourage people to use this information as one way to motivate your clients, or to emphasize the importance of when you adopt to please sustain healthy eating patterns for heart health, but also to encourage people that have reverted back to a less healthy eating pattern to give it a second go. Now, I'd like to switch back to talking about red meats, and specifically, let's spend a few minutes talking about processed meats. And the question at hand would be, can processed meats be part of a healthy eating pattern? You'll recall that from the dietary guidelines statements, this quote, "For those who eat animal products, the recommendation for the protein foods subgroup for meats, poultry, and eggs can be met by consuming a variety of lean meats, poultry, and eggs, and that these choices may include processed meats and processed poultry as long as the resulting eating pattern is within limits of the nutrients of concern for overconsumption." Now, so again, as I described earlier, one of the limitations of the scientific literature is that historically many of the cohort studies that have looked at associations between red meat intake and health have lumped unprocessed and processed meats into one category, and it's been difficult to separate out the potential effects of eating unprocessed versus processed meats on health. So here is what the guidelines suggest as a healthy eating pattern globally, and hopefully you're all well familiar with this regarding an emphasis on consuming fruits and vegetables, especially whole fruits, half of your grains as whole grains, and dairy and other fortified milk type products. And that there's a variety of foods, including lean meats and poultry, but again, they're allowed to be both unprocessed as well as processed. So let's look at the more recent literature where we've started to be able to distinguish between the effects of unprocessed versus processed meat on cardiovascular disease. And these are cohort studies. And when we look at red meat in total, so these investigations include both total unprocessed and processed red meats on cardiovascular disease development and related mortality. What we observe is that there was little to no association between how much red meat was consumed by the cohorts of people and what their risks for developing cardiovascular disease or related mortality. Likewise, when the research has specifically focused on unprocessed red meat, little to no association is shown. However, when we do look at processed meat, whether or not it's white or red or combined, then the research suggests that there is stronger and more consistent association where consuming processed meats was associated with the risk of cardiovascular disease development and related mortality. So regarding red meat and cardiovascular disease, I think it's reasonable to ask, well, is it the meat's fault? It may not be the meat per se, but it may be how the meat has been handled before it's been served to people, specifically related to the processing for preservation. And just as an example of how disparate the examples of unprocessed versus processed meats are, I've just chosen 4 different red meat. In this case, a tenderloin that's been trimmed, and a tenderloin that has not, a ham that has virtually fat-free as opposed to sausages. And it's really just to show that there's a wide variety of not only calories per serving, amounts of fat per serving, also the saturated fats per serving, especially if you get over to 13 grams in a 3-ounce portion for saturated fat. Vast differences in sodium. And one of the things that's often not thought of is that fresh red meats are very low in sodium, very good sources of protein, but it's the ingredients that are making these differences. And going from one ingredient to up to 10 to 12 is making a huge difference in what the nutrient profile is of the product. One last look at some distinctions between red meat and cardiovascular disease based on the level of processing. If you look at a cohort study that was published a few years ago now, where they looked at the relative risk for developing coronary heart disease on a per 100 grams per day of red meat intake, this is a little over 3 ounces per day. And what you can see is that for unprocessed red meat, eating more red meat had absolutely no influence, a relative risk of 1.0 on change or increasing the risk for cardiovascular disease. However, the relative risk for consuming half that amount of processed red meats actually had a relative risk of 1.42, which represents a 42% increase in risk for cardiovascular disease from consuming processed but not unprocessed red meats. Now, one last thing I'd like to talk about. I know we've been focused on cardiovascular disease, but I'd like to talk for a few moments about cancer. And processed red meats and cancer, again, the theme of it's not the meat's fault. But this slide, I just wanted to show some marketing and recommendations from the American Institute for Cancer Research. They are defining processed meat as meat preserved by some sort of smoking, curing, salting, or addition of chemical preservatives. I took this picture off of their website for their recommendations regarding red and processed meats, and they recommend avoiding all processed meats. However, they also recommend limiting red meats, and what they show is they suggest beef, pork, and lamb. What's interesting is the word limit, because what they're limiting into is 18 ounces per week, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the average intake for Americans in the U.S. Currently. And so while there's an encouragement certainly for people not to consume processed meats, it's interesting how they are projecting the encouragement for people to limit red meats, yet they're limiting it to the amount that people typically consume. What it's really suggesting may be that it really means to switch from processed to unprocessed red meats. So again, just to show the examples from the American Institute for Cancer Research's websites, that indeed red meats can be part of healthy meals as recommended by the Cancer Research Institute. These are just some examples of recipes that were available on their website that include pork, beef, chicken, and lamb. So as we conclude my presentation and get ready for a discussion, just some global conclusions. That Mediterranean-style eating patterns should be adopted and consistently consumed to promote cardiovascular health. The evidence from observational cohort studies and randomized controlled trials supports that unprocessed red meat is neutral to cardiovascular disease risk, and that lean, unprocessed red meats do not hinder the effectiveness of healthy eating patterns, including a Mediterranean-style eating pattern, to improve cardiovascular disease risk factors. And with that, I will end and thank you very much for your attention and your interest in this topic.
Hello, this is Cindy, and I'll moderate the question and answer. It is wonderful with all the questions already in the question box. So if you haven't done so, there's the question tab in the control box. Click and open the question box and you can type in the question. And I will read the question loud for everyone to hear. So, go ahead and continue to type in the questions as we go. Before we get to that, as Carol mentioned, you will receive a link to the webinar recording, as well as additional research resources and the CPE certificate as soon as it is available from CDR. With the holidays, there may be a slight delay. So let's get to the first question from Christina. Is this research done on fresh meat or also processed meat?
The research that we've done with my laboratory, we have specifically done on fresh meat with the randomized controlled trial that we did. Some of our studies, our earlier studies with DASH diet, that was part of that healthy eating pattern cycling, also included lean processed meats, and which were predominantly a low-fat ham or Canadian bacon type of product. The other studies, for the systematic review and meta-analysis, the majority of the studies from the randomized controlled trials were unprocessed meats. A few of the studies included processed meats, and there were, I believe, about 8 studies where they did not describe in sufficient detail in the manuscripts for us to know whether or not it was processed or unprocessed.
There is another question from Angela. Angela, if Americans consume 18 ounces of red meat per week on average, how do you explain that over 2/3 of Americans are overweight? That's a very good question.
I'm not sure of the context of the question, whether or not you're indicating or suggesting that eating more meat is going to cause obesity. The obesity epidemic is clearly multifaceted and much more than simply whether or not they're eating calories from meat products. The studies that we have shown done in our laboratory, and it's supported by other research, indicates that people who consume higher amounts of protein in their usual diets, and these are observational studies, generally tend to have slightly less weight, excess weight, than people who eat lower protein diets, and that we've done studies where we've manipulated the amount of red meat in people's diets while they are purposefully choosing to try to restrict calories to lose weight. And red meat is, as well as other types of animal-based protein, including eggs and dairy foods, are effective in helping people successfully lose weight while also losing less lean body mass than they do when they have a lower amount of protein in their diets.
There are questions, Dr. Campbell, that you have expressed that you come across quite frequently. and that has to do with dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol. What is beef's impact on blood cholesterol?
The cholesterol issue is very important because there's been a long-standing history in the United States and elsewhere that we should limit our dietary cholesterol as it relates to our blood cholesterol. The 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee was the first time that the presumed link between how much cholesterol you eat in your diet and how much cholesterol you eat you have in your blood may not be as strong as people think. And so there had been a long-standing recommendation to limit your total cholesterol intake, whether or not it's from red meats or whether or not it's from eggs or whether or not it's from other foods, to less than 300 milligrams per day. That recommendation was not carried forward with the 2015 dietary guidelines because the research linking how much dietary cholesterol you eat with what your blood cholesterol is just is not holding up to scientific scrutiny these days. What is important, though, is that your overall diet can have an influence on your weight control and your overall risk for cardiovascular disease, but it may not be specifically because of the meat you're eating. My recommendation is that everyone should be very mindful of what your blood cholesterol levels are, and that you, if they become high, that you work with your physician to adjust both potentially medications, but more importantly, to work with people like yourselves and other health professionals to make sure that their diet is a healthy one, that their physical activity is sufficient to promote lower cholesterol, but to target it specifically to one part of our diet is something that I'd rather avoid.
There is a question from Faith. In the meta-analysis that you mentioned, were studies only including lean meat?
I can't answer that specifically because, unfortunately, in many of the studies, there just wasn't really rigorous clarity in what the diets were. And that's a huge hindrance and frustration to being able to move this to better understand what's going on. So I can't directly answer it. I do know that I have not seen specifically a study that has looked at feeding people unprocessed meats that have different amounts of fat in the meats. So that would be a really interesting and important study to do. But I wish I had better information for you.
Okay. There is another question from Angela. Is smoked salmon considered processed meat?
It is considered processed meat because it's a method of preservation. However, we do not know what methods of there hasn't been research that I'm aware of, certainly in humans, where they have compared and contrasted the effects of different methods of processing. And in fact, that's one of the real weaknesses of our understanding of the effects of red meats and meats in general, or animal products in general, on human health, is that there really has not been a robust effort to understand the impact of processing various methods on these cardiovascular disease risk factors. So right now we're really limited to what we can glean from the cohort and observational studies.
Here's a question from Abigail. Dr. Campbell, what would you say are the limitations of your study, or what areas that you would like to see further research in?
Well, I won't characterize them as limitations. I will characterize them as just challenges of doing the research. One challenge is that when you're doing randomized controlled trials, there's only I'm just hearing a lot of static. Hopefully everybody can still hear me. When you're doing randomized controlled trials, the problem is that you can only control people's diets for so long. And so we're limited to looking at risk factors as opposed to actual morbidities and mortality. Another limitation is that these controlled feeding studies that are often done in research settings, it's hard to be able to then extrapolate the research back out into their people that are adopting these types of diets in their own home settings. And I wish that was not the case.
And here's the question from Morgan. Dr. Campbell, can you offer any insight whether is there a connection between America's intake level of meat and cardiovascular diseases versus other countries who may consume more or less meat and their rate of cardiovascular disease? Can you offer any insight on any data or studies?
That's a very good question, and one that is a real challenge to be able to answer, because most of the information that we know and the historical foundations, scientific foundations for the Mediterranean diet, like the Predimed study, were done in Europe. Actually, last year, National Institutes of Health convened a panel of scientists to look at start to design experiments that might help us understand whether or not Mediterranean diets are actually plausibly acceptable and are equally effective in with Americanized versions. Certainly, the research, like my group has been done, and other groups around the country with the randomized controlled trials, where we've asked people in various parts of the U.S. to adopt Mediterranean-style diets, supports that it will be effective here. Now we're getting beyond the efficacy of actually when we feed people defined diets and seeing whether or not they're willing to adopt them long term out when they have choice as to what they consume. Those types of studies hopefully are going to be done over the next 5 to 10 years.
Faith has another question for you, Dr. Campbell. How do you account for salt added to unprocessed meats in preparation and at the table?
We don't. And that sounds like a sort of a glib answer, but it's really because we're not in most of these studies, we're not specifically controlling what the overall profile of the diet is. We're using it as a pattern of foods, and so we're not getting down to the nutrient-specific level of assessing the impact on these foods. I will tell you that when you use unprocessed meats, then as I showed with that one slide as a demonstration, it's much more likely that we're going to have a lower sodium diet than if you're using processed meats. In my lab, most of our studies, when our diets have been developed, we're usually somewhere between 23 and about 2,800 milligrams of sodium per day. So it's not a very restrictive DASH style sodium intake amount, but we're certainly typically a little bit lower than what people typically consume when they free choose their diets.
Okay. There's another question. You mentioned lean meat several times. Could you repeat the definition of lean meat, and what's the definition of processed meat?
Yes, lean meats are any meat that a serving has less than 10 grams of fat and less than 4.5 grams of saturated fats. There's the processing, again, can be the way that I'm using the term processing is for food preservation. That could include chemical manipulations like addition of nitrates, but it also could include smoking and curing of one sort or another, drying, adding salt to it. It's any type of meats that are processed for the purposes of preservation.
That's a great question. I think what I would do is I would share with you some resources on the lean meat definition. It will be typed in the chat box. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Here is a question from Jackie. If someone eats red meat only once a week and are happy with that based on their own food preferences, should they increase their consumption of red meat to improve their health?
I would not recommend that as a major part of their diet. There's absolutely no doubt that avoiding red meat altogether can still be a very heart healthy diet. Vegetarian diets of one sort or another are well known to be generally very health promoting. And so if someone feels that their health is being promoted with limiting red meat in their diet, then of course I would encourage them to continue that. Having said that, then it really, like any diet, it would be going to their doctors and working with dietitians and other healthcare providers to if there's any concerns that they're not getting the nutrients that they may need. Certainly a vegetarian diet is going to have differences in, for example, depending on the restriction of it, vitamin B12, iron, and especially for a young woman, might be a concern for that. But no, if they enjoy the diets and they're eating a variety of foods that are part of a heart healthy eating pattern that limits meat, that's wonderful.
We have 2 more minutes. Let's see if we can squeeze in one last question from Erides Avila. Based on the data and studies, Dr. Campbell, how much consumption of red meat would you recommend per week?
I don't have a specific recommendation. My goal with this presentation and as a scientist is to be able to present and evaluate the research as we have it now. There are, and one of the hallmarks of the dietary guidelines is flexibility in eating patterns as long as they are deemed to be health promoting. And that may be a vegetarian style. It may be a U.S. healthy eating pattern that has modest amounts of red meats. Or it could be a diet like a traditional Mediterranean style, which actually has a fair amount of red meat, upwards of higher than 18 ounces per week. The The dietary guidelines, as I understand it, is really encouraging people to consider the entirety of their diet consumption, not just one particular food item. And in that case, then my encouragement would be probably to go toward leaner cuts of meat and to go to limit or avoid the processed meats, but that's based on the science as I've presented it today.
Thank you, and that's all the time we have for the questions. Victoria will now conclude the webinar.
Thank you all for attending this NISAND webinar. I am Victoria Palazinski, NISAND Executive Director, and I would like you to mark your calendar to attend this year's 2019 Annual Meeting and Expo, taking place in Syracuse on April 5th and 6th. It's going to be an exciting and high-impact networking conference that will build pathways to success. The registration opens on December 14th. Please go to eatrightny.org/AME2019 for more information. I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday. Thank you.